Welcome to Justice Reloaded HD, where ordinary kindness becomes something extraordinary. Today's story takes us into the heart of winter, where the snow was thick, the wind was sharp, and a little boy had forgotten how to smile. Until a waitress, just a seasonal hire, with warm hands and a warmer heart, did something no therapist, no fancy toy, no millionaire ever could. Before we dive in, if you believe the world needs more compassion, more hope, and more stories that remind us how powerful one small act can be, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Thank you for being here. Now, let me tell you what happened one snowy morning in Aspen. It was the kind of morning that looked like it had stepped straight out of a snow globe. Aspen, Colorado, lay wrapped in a heavy blanket of freshly fallen snow, the sky soft and silver, the trees crowned in white. At the luxurious Silver Pines Resort, fireplaces crackled behind tall windows, sending up golden flickers against the cold. Outside, children shrieked with laughter, bundled in bright coats and woolly mittens, tossing snowballs and toppling over each other while building crooked snowmen. Parents watched from the heated lounge with mugs of hot cocoa nestled in their palms, steam rising in gentle curls. Everything was picture-perfect, at least for most. Perched near the edge of the lodge's large bay window sat a boy in a wheelchair, slightly turned away from the joyful chaos outside. His name was Miles Whitaker, 8 years old, with ash-brown hair tucked beneath a beanie, his small hands resting quietly on the wheels of his chair. A car accident 2 years prior had taken the use of his legs, and with it, his trust and joy. Miles hated the cold, hated snow, and most of all, hated being watched as though he were made of glass. His father, Douglas Whitaker, stood a few feet behind him, half hidden in the shadows of the lounge. A tall man with silver-streaked hair and the stern composure of someone used to commanding boardrooms, Douglas wasn't the hugging kind of father. He loved his son, that much was clear, but in a distant, calculated way, like love was something you protected behind layers of caution and controlled schedules. A billionaire in the energy sector, Douglas had brought Miles to Aspen in hopes that a change of scenery might help. But he hadn't truly believed anything would. Miles had refused every activity. He didn't want to sled. Didn't want to meet Santa. Didn't want to join the other kids in the snow. And Douglas, instead of pushing him, had simply accepted that maybe this was just the way it would be now. But fate had a curious sense of timing. That same morning, walking briskly across the icy patio with a tray of hot drinks balanced in her gloved hands, was a woman named Emma Snow. She was 34, with kind eyes and a simple ponytail tucked into a knitted hat. A seasonal waitress at the resort, Emma moved with the calm rhythm of someone who'd done this job for years, not because she had to, but because she knew how to see people. Really see them. Before this, Emma had worked with children, at summer camps, after-school programs, even a brief stint at a center for kids with special needs. She believed, with all her heart, that no child should spend Christmas without feeling some kind of wonder. And when she caught sight of Miles staring blankly out at the snow, something in her paused. She didn't know who he was. Didn't know he was the son of a billionaire. All she saw was a little boy, all alone, watching a world he no longer felt part of. She didn't hesitate. Without saying a word, Emma crouched a few feet away in the snow and began to roll a small, perfect snowball. Not toward the kids. Not toward the camera-ready snowman being built in the main courtyard. No, she rolled it toward the boy in the wheelchair, as if the snowman she was about to build couldn't be built without him. And for the first time that winter, Miles blinked. Emma adjusted her grip on the tray of cocoa as the wind caught her coat, sending a swirl of snow around her boots. She was making her way across the patio toward one of the corner tables when she saw him, quiet, still, and heartbreakingly alone. The boy was sitting in a wheelchair, his small figure bundled in layers, but nothing about him looked warm. He didn't watch the kids playing in the snow or the parents laughing from their heated seats near the fire pit. His gaze was distant, focused on the falling snow as if it were some kind of enemy. His hands rested limp on his lap, and he flinched slightly when a couple walked past him, talking too loudly. Emma slowed down. Something inside her shifted. She recognized that type of silence, the kind that came from deep places, where words had frozen over. She placed the tray gently on the nearest table, pulled off her gloves, and stepped forward into the snow with quiet determination. She didn't call to him, didn't introduce herself. Instead, she crouched down and began to roll a handful of snow into a small, compact ball. Her movements were deliberate, almost playful. She glanced at the boy out of the corner of her eye, but he didn't move. Still, she continued. As the ball grew larger, she smiled softly and said, "You know, I think this snowman might need a supervisor." No response. She pressed on, her tone warm and gently teasing. "Otherwise, I have a feeling he's going to end up with his hat on backward. And that would be a disaster." The boy remained still, his eyes slightly narrowed, but there was a flicker, almost imperceptible, a hesitation in his stillness. Emma felt it. She gave the snowball one last roll and positioned it in front of her. Then she did something unexpected. She winked. Not patronizing. Not dramatic. Just a quick, sincere wink, like two co-conspirators about to pull off a harmless heist. Still no words. But a full minute later, she saw it. A nod. So small, it could have been missed. But to Emma, it was everything. Her heart swelled. She gently rolled the snowball toward him, stopping it a foot from his wheels. Then, wordlessly, she reached into her apron and pulled out a small rubber-tipped cane, the kind often used by kids with limited mobility, and placed it gently beside him. No instructions. No pressure. And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Miles reached for it. He lifted the cane slowly, his hand trembling just slightly from the cold or nerves, or both, and tapped the top of the snowball with it. Not hard. Just a light pat, almost like a greeting. Emma grinned. "That's what I call an executive decision," she said quietly. Miles didn't respond, but something had changed. The space between them felt warmer, less rigid. As if the snow wasn't the only thing softening that morning. Unbeknownst to either of them, just inside the lounge, behind a tall pane of fogged-up glass, Douglas Whitaker stood completely still. He had watched the entire thing unfold, the way the waitress didn't rush, didn't force, didn't offer pity. Just presence. Simple, human presence. His grip on the coffee cup slackened slightly, and for a long moment, he couldn't take his eyes off his son. For the first time in years, the boy had moved toward something, toward someone. And it hadn't come from him. That evening, the snow hadn't stopped falling, blanketing the entire resort in a hushed, silvery calm. From the large windows of the fine dining room inside Silver Pines, the world looked like a postcard, white drifts catching the soft glow of string lights, the wind gently brushing against frosted panes. Emma adjusted the sleeves of her cardigan nervously as she followed the maitre d' toward a small table tucked near the fireplace. She hadn't expected the invitation. When the resort manager had found her after her shift and quietly said, "Mr. Whitaker would like to have dinner with you," she'd almost said no. But something in her heart whispered that this wasn't just dinner, it was something else. Douglas stood when she approached, nodding politely, not smiling but not cold either. He looked more relaxed than he had earlier in the day, though the deep lines in his forehead hinted at years of worries not easily shaken off. "Thank you for coming," he said, pulling out a chair for her. Emma nodded. Of course. The waiter poured water, lit the candle between them, and disappeared without a word. For a few moments, there was only the sound of firewood cracking nearby. Then Douglas leaned forward slightly, hands folded in front of him. "I don't usually do this," he began. "Invite staff to dinner." Emma raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to smile. He sighed softly. "But what happened this morning? I saw you with my son." She hesitated, unsure where this was going. "I hope I didn't overstep. I didn't even know who he was, I just—" Douglas lifted a hand gently, stopping her. "You didn't overstep." He paused, looked into the fire, then said almost in a whisper, Do you know that he once tried to burn every winter photo he had? Emma blinked. What? Douglas nodded slowly. 2 years ago, after the accident. He used to love winter. We'd go to Lake Tahoe every Christmas. Snowball fights, snowmen, sledding. He couldn't get enough of it. He looked down at his hands. And then he lost the use of his legs. The first snowfall after the hospital, he screamed at the window. Said winter betrayed him. He took every picture we had, family ski trips, snow forts, snow angels, and tried to set them on fire in the backyard. Emma's heart clenched. I never brought him back to the mountains after that, Douglas continued, voice low. Until now. I thought maybe something would change. But I didn't expect anything. He hasn't smiled in months. He hasn't reached for anything. He looked at her, eyes a little glassy but not broken. Until today. Emma swallowed hard. I didn't do anything special. I just saw a boy who looked like he needed a snowman. Douglas gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Sometimes that's more than enough. There was a pause. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a card, handwritten, neat, elegant. It's not a job offer, he said. I don't want you to be a nanny or a therapist. I just want you to keep doing whatever you did today. Emma looked at the card. Come by each day, he said. You don't have to bring anything. You don't even have to talk. Just be around when it snows. The sincerity in his voice stunned her. She nodded slowly, holding the card in both hands. Okay, she said softly. I can do that. And for the first time that day, Douglas exhaled, as if the weight on his chest had lightened just enough for him to breathe again. Emma stared at the card in her hand long after Douglas had left the table. She turned it over once, twice, as if expecting different words to appear, some kind of clause, some hidden obligation. But it was simple. Just his name, his suite number, and the quiet invitation to return the next day. She should have felt honored. Grateful, even. But all she felt was fear. Her last job working with children hadn't ended well. She had been part of a holiday program for special needs kids, one she'd poured her heart into. But one snowy afternoon, she had let a group of them, wheelchairs, braces, and all, play in a roped-off section of the playground. A parent had complained. A supervisor had panicked. Emma was let go by the end of the week. No severance. No thank you. Just a quiet warning that liability was not something to mess with. She told herself she had moved on. But the truth was, she hadn't worked with kids since. So why now? Why this boy? She got her answer the next morning. As she passed the lobby on her way to clock in, she saw Miles through the glass, alone again, a sketchbook in his lap. And on the page, faint but clear, was the outline of a snowman. Its face was crooked. Its smile lopsided. But it was smiling. Emma swallowed hard. No, this wasn't about money. It was about finishing what had been started, because a snowman, like a child's trust, couldn't be built with just one pair of hands. Each morning, the snow lay fresh like a new canvas, and each morning, Emma showed up just before the first footprints could mark it. She no longer wore her server apron during those hours. She simply showed up in a thick coat, gloves with one fingertip missing, and that red knit hat she always tugged down when she was thinking. Miles would already be waiting, never asking for her, never calling, but always there. Always watching. They didn't say much. In fact, most days passed without more than a handful of words between them. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else entirely. Peaceful. Honest. Emma would crouch beside the partially built snowman, still only a body and head, and pull out a handful of silly decorations from her oversized coat pockets. Today, she said once, holding up a lopsided blue sock, I think he needs a proper winter hat. Miles didn't respond, but he took the sock from her. Together, They rolled it and shaped it until it resembled something close to a beanie. They placed it gently on top of the snowman's head, only to realize it sat slightly askew. Emma raised an eyebrow. "Fashion forward," she offered. Miles gave the smallest of nods. Another day, she brought a carrot. Not a straight one. This one bent sharply near the tip. She held it up like it was a prized possession. "I found this in the bottom of the produce bin," she said. "Looks like it's been through something." She offered it to him, and with a deliberate motion, he stuck it into the snowman's face. Crooked, of course. "Perfect," she whispered. Later in the week, they attempted arms, 2 long twigs Emma had tied with red and gold ribbon to make them look more cheerful. The snow was too soft for them to stay, so she dug a little deeper and used the ribbon to anchor them from behind. Miles watched her work. Then reached forward with his cane, tapping one ribbon to straighten it. It was such a small action, but to Emma, it felt monumental. These were no longer just crafts. They were a language between them, made of crooked carrots, ribbon-bound sticks, and mismatched hats. Every choice was deliberate, every imperfection a signature of ownership. When the snowman was finally standing tall, hat lopsided, nose curved, arms waving awkwardly like he was in the middle of a dance, Emma stepped back beside Miles. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Miles looked up at the snowman, then turned his head slightly toward Emma. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. But he reached out and gently patted the back of her gloved hand. It was the same every day. After each session, as Emma dusted the snow from her coat and prepared to leave, Miles would offer that same small gesture, a quiet pat on the hand. Not a goodbye. Not a thank you. Just connection. It was the kind of affection that required no explanation. The kind born not from grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but from showing up. From consistency. From rolling up your sleeves and making something lopsided in the cold, simply because it made someone else feel less alone. Douglas Whitaker had always believed in control. In his world, control meant success, stocks that rose, contracts signed, assets secured. He knew how to measure risk, manage perception, and silence emotions when necessary. But watching his son each morning, framed by snow and innocence, he realized there were parts of life where control meant nothing at all. Every day, just as the sun filtered pale gold through the icicles hanging from the resort eaves, Douglas found his spot, sometimes in the corner booth of the lounge, sometimes standing near the second-floor balcony that overlooked the courtyard. From there he could see them, Miles and the woman named Emma. They didn't know he was watching. And somehow, that made it easier to see what was real. At first, he had gripped his mug too tightly, his knuckles white around the ceramic. Not out of anger, but fear. Fear that this fragile progress might shatter under the weight of his son's silence. Fear that trusting someone outside of doctors and protocols might backfire. Fear that what he was witnessing was just a fleeting moment, not something sustainable. But then he saw the ribbon-wrapped sticks. The crooked carrot nose. The silent exchange of glances and gestures. And slowly, the tightness in his chest began to ease. His hands loosened around the cup. His breathing steadied. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't part of any plan. And yet, it was working. One morning, while Douglas stood by the fireplace nursing his coffee, he overheard a pair of employees whispering near the staff entrance. "She's just a seasonal waitress, right?" one said, voice edged with something between curiosity and judgment. "Why is she out there with them every day like she's family?" The other shrugged. "I heard Mr. Whitaker invited her. Personally. That can't be true though, right?" Douglas didn't interrupt. He let them have their moment. He was used to whispers. People always had something to say about the way he ran his life, his business, his fortune, his family. But this was different. Later that day, as he stepped out into the courtyard for the first time instead of watching from inside, one of the managers approached him. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, hesitantly. "Some of the staff have been asking about the woman." Emma. Just wondering what role she plays here. Douglas looked out across the snowy lawn, where Emma was gently tying a scarf around the snowman's neck while Miles looked on, the corners of his mouth twitching towards something dangerously close to a smile. He didn't turn to the manager. He simply said with quiet finality, "My son doesn't need another specialist." A pause. "He needs a real winter." And with that, Douglas took a seat on the bench at the edge of the courtyard, not to interfere, not to instruct. Just to be closer to the thing he couldn't explain but was beginning to understand. There was something sacred unfolding in the snow outside Silver Pines. And it had nothing to do with titles or status. It had everything to do with one boy, one woman, and a snowman that was becoming more than just a pile of snow. The storm didn't come from the sky. It came from a smartphone. It started with a clip, 32 seconds, grainy, shaky, clearly taken from behind a frost-covered window. In it, Emma was pushing Miles's wheelchair gently through the snow, his gloved hands raised in front of him as if catching flakes, while she leaned forward to say something that made him laugh. A real laugh, though faint and fleeting. But the internet didn't see that. What it saw, what it chose to amplify, was a single frame, a waitress pushing a billionaire's son across an icy path, without a coat thick enough for the cold, without security, without the ever-present air of controlled supervision people expected from a man like Douglas Whitaker. Within hours, the caption was everywhere. Billionaire leaves disabled son in hands of seasonal worker. The headline was inflammatory. The assumptions worse. Comment threads exploded with outrage, speculation, armchair analysis of everything from Emma's clothing to Miles's posture. By noon, Douglas's inbox was flooded. His assistants had left voicemails, flagged press alerts, and drafted statements before he even knew what had happened. He watched the video once. Then again. And again. And even though part of him wanted to defend it, to see it for what it truly was, a quiet moment of joy between a child and the only person who'd gotten through to him, another part of him was gripped by a much older instinct: protect the family. Protect the legacy. Control the narrative. He stared at his phone for a long while before setting it down on his desk with a heavy thud. Outside, the snowman still stood, his bent carrot nose and floppy hat untouched by the chaos unraveling online. Later that evening, Emma returned from her shift to find an envelope taped to the door of her rented room near the resort's service quarters. Inside was a typed letter, short, formal, and signed. Effective immediately, you are requested to step back from all informal contact with the Whitaker family. We appreciate your time and understanding. No explanation. No call. No goodbye. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, the envelope crumpling slightly in her hand as she read it again. And again. She didn't cry. She didn't storm back to the lodge. She simply went to her dresser, pulled out the red knit hat she always wore with Miles, and folded it neatly in her lap. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a piece of lined paper, and began to write, slow, careful, honest words that wouldn't go viral, wouldn't be quoted or dissected, but would be real. When she returned to the snowy courtyard one last time, the sun was dipping low, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. No one stopped her. No one even saw her. She walked straight to the snowman, now beginning to lean slightly from the changing temperature, and placed the red hat gently on its head. Then she tucked the folded paper into its base. It read, "Your son helped a snowman smile. Please don't let that freeze over again." The sky was turning a pale gray, and the snowman stood silently in the courtyard, slightly tilted, as if mourning something it couldn't name. The wind was gentler that evening, brushing softly against the fir trees, and yet the air felt heavier, like something was missing. Emma walked slowly across the frozen lawn, her boots crunching against the packed snow. There were no children laughing now. No snowball fights or cocoa trays. Just her and the cold. She stopped in front of the snowman, the one she and Miles had built together day after day. His crooked carrot nose was still in place, the ribbon-tied arms stretching outward as if asking for something that would never come again. Emma pulled the red knit hat from her coat pocket. It was the same one she'd worn every morning they spent out here, laughing quietly, building piece by imperfect piece. She hesitated only a second before gently placing it on the snowman's head, adjusting it so it leaned just slightly to the right, just the way Miles had once liked. Then she reached into her other pocket and unfolded a small note. The paper was creased from her gloves, her handwriting simple and clear. She tucked it into the snowman's base, pressing it down so it wouldn't blow away. Your son helped a snowman smile. Please don't let him freeze over again. And with that she turned and walked away, leaving nothing behind but woolen words, and the memory of a boy's quiet joy written in snow. Douglas Whitaker stood at the edge of his study, a quiet room tucked behind a wall of frosted glass and mahogany. In his hand was a tablet, paused on a still frame from the video that had flipped his world inside out. The headlines, the backlash, the sudden severance from something that had just begun to mend, it all made sense now. It wasn't concern. It wasn't a guest worried for Miles's safety. The clip had been taken and posted by a guest. He had politely declined a private dinner invitation with days earlier. Someone who had expected favor and attention, and when denied, chose instead to wound what they couldn't control. The discovery made Douglas's stomach turn. Not because of the betrayal, he was used to that in business, but because of what it had cost. He had let fear rule him. Fear of scandal. Fear of perception. And in doing so, he had driven away the one person who had made his son come alive again. Outside the window, the courtyard was quiet. The snow had started to melt along the edges, dripping from the tips of the evergreens like tears. The snowman, the one Miles and Emma had built together, was beginning to slouch. His head tilted forward as if in mourning. The red knit hat still clung to his lumpy crown, but his features were softening, dissolving into formless white. Douglas turned away from the window. He found Miles in the small reading nook of their suite, curled in the oversized armchair he liked best, a blanket tucked over his legs and a sketchbook balanced on his lap. The boy wasn't drawing. Just staring out the same window, his eyes hollow and unfocused. Douglas sat beside him, not too close. He didn't speak at first. Just looked out with him, both of them silent as the snowman continued his slow surrender to the sun. After a long while, Douglas spoke. "What would you like to do tomorrow?" Miles didn't answer immediately. His gaze stayed on the melting snowman, watching as a chunk of packed snow slid off one side of its torso and crumbled into slush. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Miles replied, "Build a new one." Douglas turned to look at him. "But," Miles continued, blinking slowly, "without Miss Emma, it won't be fun." The words hit harder than Douglas expected. Not because they were defiant or emotional, but because of how simple and true they were. It wasn't about the snowman. It never had been. It was about the quiet patience Emma had offered. The gentle way she didn't force anything. The way she saw Miles, not as a patient or a fragile thing, but as a boy. A whole boy, capable of creating crooked smiles in the snow. Douglas swallowed. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. Miles didn't respond, but his head tilted slightly in his father's direction. "I thought I was protecting you," Douglas continued, voice steady but low. "But I wasn't. I was protecting myself. From people. From judgment. From the internet." Another pause. "But you weren't the one who needed protecting. You were the one doing the saving." For a moment, Douglas thought he might have said too much. That Miles would retreat again, close himself off behind that silent wall. But instead, the boy shifted the sketchbook off his lap and turned toward his father, really looking at him. "Can we bring her back?" Miles asked. Douglas nodded slowly. "If she's willing," he said, "we'll do everything we can." And with that, something softened in the room. Not unlike the snow outside, but instead of melting, it warmed. Just enough to open a door. The snow was falling again, soft and steady, as Douglas stepped carefully down the narrow, icy path behind the resort. He wasn't used to this part of Aspen. The The side streets were seasonal workers' rented rooms, where boots were left outside doorways and porch lights flickered from old wiring. In his gloved hand, he carried a red knit hat, still dusted with fresh snow. It had sat for days on top of the now-collapsed Snowman, stiff from the cold but unmistakably hers. Emma's. He reached the small cottage and hesitated only a moment before knocking. No security. No driver waiting. Just a father, one who had learned the hard way that some things couldn't be outsourced. When the door opened, Emma stood there with a surprised look on her face, coat draped over one arm, like she had been halfway out. Her eyebrows lifted slightly when she saw the hat in his hand. Douglas offered it forward. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. Emma took the hat gently, brushing off the snow. She didn't speak. Douglas cleared his throat. "I owe you more than an apology." Emma looked at him carefully, the hurt not gone but not sharp anymore. He continued, quieter now. "You taught my son something I couldn't. You reminded him that winter isn't something to fear. And you taught me," he paused, meeting her eyes, "that there are things a father can't buy. But if he pays attention, he can learn." The silence between them was thick with things unsaid, but also filled with something new. Forgiveness. Respect. A thread of trust, still fragile but real. Emma smiled softly. "You're a good dad, Mr. Whitaker. You just needed the right kind of snow." Weeks later, Silver Pines Resort opened its grounds for the first ever Build Again Winter Festival, a free event designed especially for children with disabilities. There were adaptive sleds, accessible snow art stations, and rows of helpers in matching scarves guiding little hands to sculpt snowmen of every shape and size. In the center of it all stood Emma, clipboard in hand, laughter on her lips. She moved from station to station with ease, checking on cocoa supplies, rearranging ribbon bins, giving out hugs like candy. And beside her, wearing a crisp coat and a proud but quiet expression, was Douglas. Not in charge. Just present. Emma wasn't a waitress anymore. She was co-founder of Build Again, the nonprofit that would now bring joy and creativity to kids across snowy towns each winter. And at the edge of the festival circle, sitting among a group of bundled-up children with mismatched mittens, was Miles. He was watching a younger boy attempt to place a carrot on a snowman's face. When it drooped, Miles giggled, an actual unguarded giggle, and leaned forward to help straighten it. Then he reached into his own pocket and pulled out a brand-new red knit hat. He placed it gently on the snowman's head. When Emma passed by, he looked up at her, his face full of something he hadn't shown in years. "He's not gonna melt this time," Miles said, grinning. "We built him all the way from the heart." And somewhere behind the laughter, the wind carried the truth like a promise. Some snowmen may melt, but the warmth they leave behind never does. If you believe that even the smallest act of kindness can bring warmth to the coldest heart this winter, please give this video a like. And don't forget to subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD so you won't miss the next story that reminds us all what truly matters. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. We'll see you again next week, with another tale of hope, heart, and humanity. Stay warm out there.